All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin. I'm the training coordinator here with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I'd like to welcome you to our quarterly webinar series, our Cooperative Technical Partners Information Exchange. Today, we're going to be talking about FEMA's Future of Flood Risk Data Initiative. But before we get into that, I just have a few admin announcements I want to go over with you all to orient you to the presentation today. First things first, just a note on sort of the structure of the presentation today and how to participate. Um, we've got about 90 minutes set aside for this, hopefully we'll get you out of here on time. But just wanted to let you know this is an hour and a half event, and we do have a big audience, so all lines are muted from an attendee perspective. But we do want to encourage you to participate, and so to that end, if you have questions or comments on anything you see from today, you can use the Q&A feature within the Zoom interface, and just write down those questions or comments, send them in, and we'll take as many questions as we can, kind of as time allows. Um, but go ahead and use the Q&A to communicate that with us. The other thing, as far as interaction, is there will be several poll questions throughout the presentation today. So those will pop up automatically on your screen. You can interact with them, answer them, and then we'll move on. And like I said, there will be several of those. So just keep an eye out for those as well. Note on continuing education credits, this webinar is approved for 1 CEC for CFMs and 1 CM for AICPs. You'll earn those credits if you participate in the entire event today. If you're a CFM, you'll get the credit applied to your record automatically. If you're a national level CFM, that process will take about a week for us to go through and do that on the back end. But in the meantime, we'll also be sending you a certificate of attendance if you earn credit today. We'll be sending you that certificate of attendance along with a few other items of follow-up, including the slide presentation and so forth. Again, that'll come to your inbox in about a week's time. So please be patient on that front. And just a final note that if you're viewing this in a group setting, if you're not signed in under your own name, you're not going to be eligible to receive credit today. So just a couple additional logistics. Again, this is a quarterly CTP information exchange webinar. So it's something where we're always on the lookout for great topics. If you know of a topic or perhaps a presenter, please feel free to reach out to Alan Luloff. His email address is up on the screen there, and go ahead and give us a suggestion. But other than that, thank you very much for joining us today. And now I'd like to turn it over to Alan with our Flood Science Center here at ASFPM to talk about a little bit about the CTP subcommittee and about our topic today. So Alan, take it away. Hey, Alan.
Resolution in support of the FEMA Cooperating Technical Partners Program, highlighting the importance this initiative is to our organization. And at about the same time, we created a Cooperating Technical Partner Subcommittee, which is under the ASFPM Mapping and Engineering Standards Committee. And that is co-chaired by Joanna Rolfe with Kansas and Dave Gannett with the state of Maryland. And we have routinely try to come up with topics that are of interest to cooperating technical partners. And as you can see, the goals of this subcommittee are listed here. And one of those is provide opportunities for information exchange, which is the focus of this webinar, and identifying training needs, which also fills into this slot. So again, the presentation today is by Christina Lindemer. She is a coastal engineer and team lead at FEMA headquarters, where she works in the engineering resources branch, which is led by Dave Bascom. She works with a technical team to develop methodology and data for the Future of Flood Risk Data Initiative. And prior to this, she was a senior coastal engineer with FEMA Region 4 in Atlanta, where she provided technical guidance and project management for coastal flood hazard mapping efforts throughout the Southeast. She has a bachelor and master's degree in engineering from civil engineering from the University of Delaware. And she's going to be presenting today on FEMA's Future of Flood Risk Data Initiative.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. I hope that you guys are seeing my screen now.
Yep, looks good.
The presentation. Great. Thank you so much. Like Alan said, Christina Lindemer, I am a coastal engineer by training, but working on the future of flood risk data, specifically the methodology and data development, and that's what I'm really going to focus on today. But I'm also going to provide an overview of what the initiative FFRD, or Future of Flood Risk Data, is, what led to it, and then how we're actually developing the data and developing partnerships with other federal agencies in the production of methodologies and modeling procedures. And then I'm going to demonstrate some of the data that we've already gotten in for coastal geography to show some of the data and use cases that we think we're able to achieve, but also as a demonstration of just what this data actually looks like in practice. Because we throw the term probabilistic around a lot without actually showing what it is. So I'm hoping that you can gain an appreciation of the richness of this data through this presentation. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with RiskMap and how the RiskMap program, or flood mapping, is actually just one component of the larger National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, ecosystem, which is also made up of flood insurance, flood mitigation assistance, and floodplain management. The RiskMap program stands for Risk Mapping, Assessment, and Planning, and it aims to provide communities with better flood risk information and tools to help them assist with updating their hazard mitigation plans and better protect their citizens. There has been an evolution of the flood mapping program over the years, with RiskMap starting in 2009, specifically created to address gaps in available flood data. The fact that there was a lack of a relationship between flood risk communications and reductions in flood vulnerability. Lack of coordination amongst SLTT mitigation planning efforts, an IT system that was aging and needed improvements, and to also improve program delivery within the National Flood Insurance Program. And RiskMap has been very successful over the years, and the Future of Flood Risk Data is an initiative under RiskMap to provide a framework for the mapping program to continue to move into the future, and in particular, move towards a risk-informed NFIP, and to help us identify where we know the minimum standards are not enough, where there are areas of residual risk outside of the SFHA, and be able to better reflect all flood hazards that structure space. I have a note at the bottom, and I hope it will work in the PDF, and I can share the link also. But we have updated the RiskMap multi-year plan in response to a request from GIO. And this has also been posted on FEMA.gov for more information. And it does a really good job of talking about the updates to the RiskMap program and how we will evolve over the next several years. And it reflects the FFRD initiative within the multi-year plan. And if the link does not work, you can just Google RiskMap multi-year plan, FEMA.gov, and I think it's the first thing that pops up, any of those terms. So SFRD did not just come out of the blue. We've had a lot of drivers over the years. Some have been internal. The first one was the update and the rating cycles that the actuaries do. Most recently with the desire to look at areas of flooding outside of the SFHA and have a more probabilistically based analysis of what flood hazards are, all flood hazards, and the uncertainties along with them, due to the fact that the SFHA is kind of a cliff of information for the actuaries. We have a special flood hazard area, and then sometimes the 500-year, and then there's little information beyond that in many areas. And for actuarial soundness, they needed a more comprehensive understanding of all hazards in an area. At the same time, and complementing that, there was the risk-informed NFIP to support all the legs of the NFIP stool with flood hazard and flood risk information. And I'm going to get to that distinction in a few slides. We also, over the years, have had a lot of feedback, including NFIP customer experiences, and lots of feedback from our stakeholders on how change is needed to the program. And this was emphasized again by TMAC in recent years, where they have explicitly stated that risk maps should shift from flood hazards to structure-specific risk, incorporate future conditions, and leverage probabilistic mapping or graduated risk to do so. And you kind of see an image of that on the background here. Although before all of those things occurred, we have been hearing this for even longer. On the left here, you see a report from 2000 by the National Academies to the Army Corps of Engineers, reviewing their transition from a free board approach to risk-based analysis for designing their flood studies. And in this, they were looking at how well the Corps was doing and how to best do risk analysis. And within this report, the National Academies National Research Center Council recommended that we use annual exceedance probabilities as the basis for engineering risk calculations, leveraging probabilistic techniques that importantly quantify the uncertainty in the underlying assessment. They recommended, related to levies, that you evaluate levies as a system instead of sort of segment by segment, and look at the impact of the whole system, and use risk management techniques to support decision making, going beyond just the hazard. What is the actual impact of the flood hazard on the ground to support your decision making and prioritization? And then in, I think it was 2012, another report came out from the National Academies directed towards the National Flood Insurance Program, specific to levies, but it echoed some of these messages, saying that rate setting behind all levies should use modern risk analysis, using the new advancements in sciences to calculate annual exceedance probabilities, and then the damages or risks or vulnerabilities associated with them. This report also recommended that FEMA and the Corps of Engineers develop a common approach for levies using methodology, procedure, sharing of models, and risk analysis tools to do this, and to allow one federal messaging using transparent data, open discussions, and decisions in this report. And that FEMA should assume a leadership role in providing direction for research, development, and release of flood risk communication products and maps behind levies. And we at FEMA have taken these reports to heart, along with other recommendations that I previously mentioned that we've had from our stakeholders. And we are working very closely with the Corps of Engineers, as has been historically recommended, as we have very complementary authorizations, missions, and skill sets in the flood space. And we are both moving now in the same direction of risk-informed approaches, risk-informed decision-making, whereas before Sometimes we would have challenges where the Corps of Engineers is speaking in risk-based decision-making and FEMA is speaking in freeboard above a deterministic event. But we're both moving together to talk about risk, and for either of us to be successful, we need to be working together and not causing challenges for our two agencies. And we are working closely with the Corps beyond just levees. They have been our partner for developing coastal data for the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes, which I'll be discussing in a little bit, as well as our partner for identifying methodologies to address compound flooding, where you have coastal and riverine systems coming together and producing increased flood risk. Working with them on levee and dam methodology, structure-specific risk, and just general model development through standard operating procedures that we will be leveraging under FFRD. So the Corps will be with us through this experience. But they will not be alone. We are working with other partners as well. We are working with the USGS, as we have traditionally, for LiDAR-based information, as well as mixed populations of flood flow contributors for gauged areas in the US. We have a research project going on with them. And we are working with NOAA on sea level rise and then addressing precipitation needs for FFRD through information exchanges. The promise of FFRD and our interagency approaches have been recognized as we've been talking about them throughout the past few years by the interagency and other groups such as the National Climate Task Force that has recently said that this initiative will help meet the nation's need for comprehensive hazard and risk data to drive decisions. And to top it off, my last slide on the pressure we have here is it has recently been promoted by FEMA leadership as well as part of our annual planning guidance, objective 2.3, which is to empower risk-informed decision-making. The annual planning guidance for 2023 specifies that we will be rebuilding and revamping our mapping methodologies and capabilities through the Risk Map Future of Flood Risk Data Initiative. And that this work will serve as a foundation as we look to modernize the National Flood Mapping Program to better align with the community's full risk. And this data is meant to really pull back the legs of the stool together and provide a data set of comprehensive flood hazard and risk information that can be leveraged throughout the National Flood Insurance Program and help us understand the full spectrum of flood risk in an area. And so next slide, I'm going to ask a poll question, which I think should pop up. I'm really curious to know, beyond what I have just said to you today, how familiar you are with FFRD as an audience. So please answer this poll for us.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. This is Kevin once again. So the poll is open. Go ahead and weigh in. We'll give you maybe 30 seconds or so, and then we'll take a peek at the results.
Excellent. Yes, there's a lot of you on the phone. And so I'm curious how many of you guys have heard about it. If you're going to ASFPM this June, the conference we're planning on, or we're hoping, we've submitted a bunch of abstracts on it, and we're hoping to share more information. Okay, great. I see the results, Kevin. Is there anything you wanted to add, or can I speak to them?
No, go ahead. Sorry, I accidentally clicked them down, but you can go ahead and speak on the results.
Okay, great. Well, this is good to know that some of you folks are minimally familiar with it, and that's understandable and expected. Hoping that this presentation will help you guys become more familiar with it. But I'm also curious about what types of venues would be better to share more about FFRD, and I'm going to ask a poll question at the end, somewhat related to that. Okay. So next slide, I am going to talk about the difference between flood hazard and flood risk. And so on the left is the familiar flood insurance rate map that we all have come to love. And in this, you have a depiction of a flood hazard for a very specific frequency, the 1% or 100-year or 0.2% or 500-year floodplain. And that's what you see in the blue and the orange on the left. But if you owned a structure, or we're thinking about purchasing a structure within this area designated by the cartoon house, it's hard to understand exactly what that AE, what is it, a 9 at the structure, actually, how it actually relates to that structure. Is that structure built way up in the air where this flood hazard is just going to easily pass below it whenever it occurs? Or is it perhaps slab on grade where the flooding during the 1% would go well inside the house? So one of the beauties of going to flood risk is that we're taking those hazards and we're actually looking at how it intersects with the house and what happens if something we love, such as our home, was exposed to a hazard by flooding, like flooding. And so through FFRD, we'll have a better understanding of all the contributors that could flood the structure, whether it's lots of rain, riverine flow, coastal, as well as the small and large events that can impact it, as well as understand how a structure in the floodplain specifically could respond to that flooding. Is it just a little bit of water, or is the couch completely underwater? And in this example, we're showing that during a flood, 3 to 4 feet of water could enter the home and cause extensive damages, which we can quantify either in percent loss of the structure's value or a monetary number when we are talking about flood risk. That is the difference. We are taking the flood hazard and intersecting it with the built environment. In addition to going from to flood risk, we are also transitioning from having very binary black and white lines on the map, which you see here, through the VE zone, AE, X, shaded X, and transitioning to graduated depictions of flood hazards at any specific location in the floodplain. Okay, so FFRD is the risk map initiative, as I mentioned, to create comprehensive flood hazard and flood risk information. And it has 4 objectives within it. Today, I'm speaking mostly about objective 1, which is the shift from a binary hazard and risk analysis of a certain structure, whether it's in or out of a floodplain, to a probabilistic one that evaluates all flood scenarios and depicts that information in a graduated manner. Second, FFRD aims to modernize FEMA's management and delivery of flood data through the creation of dynamic and flexible services and tools. So that way our flood hazard and risk information that we're creating here and the underlying models themselves are accessible to access and improve and share with our stakeholders. These resources, when made available in a modernized data management system, should empower stakeholders in the private sector, CTPs, and other state, local, tribal, and territorial entities that have a role in both the development and deployment of such tools to do so and access this data and deliver it to your communities. And finally, increasing the access to the rich hazard and risk information, we hope will ultimately drive more risk-informed decisions, mitigation planning, insurance actions, and help us to have a more risk-informed NFIP that works for many different types of users and decision makers that we have. Okay, so I'm going to take us through how the flood hazard analysis that is done under FFRD is different from our traditional approach, which is depicted on the left. That's our traditional binary approach, and on the right, I will show our FFRD approach. But for inland flood sources in the past and up until recently, most of our analyses have been based on 1D modeling, where we define cross sections across certain stream segments and define our floodplain characteristics. We have traditionally looked at the most hazardous flood sources and watersheds. We have over 1 million miles of rivers and streams studied in this manner, where we start at the center line and we're really just moving out until we reach the 100 or 500 year floodplains and developing our SFHAs. This is again done for often very specific event-based analyses. However, in the future, FFRD is going to continue building on what we've already started with a lot of the 2D modeling approaches, such as those seen in some DLE studies, base level engineering studies. And we are going to leverage these approaches that can analyze all flooding sources within an area, both fluvial and pluvial. So we can look at how the water is moving through the streams and rivers, and then what happens when heavy rainfall just falls into a watershed. And so while this leverages 2D methodologies that we may all be familiar with from DLE, those DLE studies have historically been still event-based, where they namely have a very specific flood event or a few flood events that they are analyzing that are in connection to our regulatory and statutory requirements that we have. However, in the future, we are moving towards probabilistic methodologies, where we are evaluating hazards for many different flood scenarios across a wide range of storm probabilities and intensities and durations and temporal distributions that are characteristic of a given watershed. As I said, I'm a coastal engineer by training. One of the reasons why I am here and working on this is actually pretty similar to how we already do our coastal studies. We look at many different potential storm paths of hurricanes or extratropical storms. We account for their likelihood in that area of occurrence as part of our analysis. And we already have the basis of a lot of our storm surge studies that are currently on coastal flood insurance studies is already probabilistic in the way that it's developing its still water elevation. So it's due to this probabilistic environment that we anticipate that coastal is going to be able to and is moving forward in the advancement of developing data for FFRD, as well as accounting for current and future conditions, incorporating sea level rise, to help us look at other types of flooding scenarios. And so that is the type of analysis that we're moving to for the inland approach. I'm going to talk about the stochastic storm transposition used to do that in a few slides. But this may also change what the data information you receive from a study is as well, the key outputs. On the left, again, this is our traditional or binary approach, where studies were initiated with the end product being the flood insurance rate map. And anything that came through developing that flood insurance map was delivered. Whereas in the future, under the future of flood risk data, it's a non-regulatory emphasis, whereas we are creating available flood hazard information that is graduated for many return periods. And we are exploring having an extractable regulatory boundary that can be used and developed where needed to what standards are appropriate for your community, And all of this can be done due to the probabilistic nature of the assessments that we're suggesting here, and be built off of the flood hazard curves, which will be located all throughout the watershed, kind of like a point or click application that I'll show later on that we're exploring. So that way you can know the probability of flooding anywhere in a watershed versus just along maybe a stream center line that we have done historically. When you take this wealth of flood hazard information and you intersect it with structural data about that you know about the built environment or perhaps buildings that you're planning on building, as well as taking damage functions, traditionally known as depth damage functions, but they express the type of losses that a structure may see based off of a certain type of or amount of flooding. So we have suites of damage functions that talk about how different structures respond to different types of flood hazards, whether it's high waves, low waves, still water, fresh water, salt water, piles, piers, closed foundation, slab on grade. All of those types of buildings have individual damage functions that express how they experience losses during a flood event. So by taking the flood hazard data, the structural data, and then the damage functions, we're able to translate our information into impacts and flood risk, which again, we can express through building loss, percent damage, also look at things such as debris created during a flood event, damages to foundations, things along those lines. And this is the data that we are trying to create through FFRD. It's all the way from initiating a watershed study and taking it all the way to the impacts on the built environment. And with this data, when you put all the data in an intelligent, responsive manner, and you apply data retrieval and processing techniques to it, you can achieve many different outcomes from the same basic data bundle. And that's what we're showing here. A foundation of solid engineering models and data can then be used to derive many different individual use cases across the NFIP, from mitigation and planning to floodplain management, insurance, building science, and then even disaster response type analysis from the underlying data. Okay, so we are at another poll question. Hopefully you have a little bit more information about what comprehensive flood hazard and risk information actually is. And I'm curious, which stakeholder groups do you think will be most impacted by the availability of this information in an open source, accessible manner?
All right, thanks again, Christina. So same as last time, everybody, give you about 30 seconds or so. Go ahead and weigh in, and then we'll look at the results as a group.
All right, excellent answers. Homeowners, floodplain managers. I definitely think that homeowners, I'm hoping that they use this information for more risk-informed decision-making. Floodplain managers, I'm also hopeful. But I would like to see this information be useful, maybe not maybe impactful in a positive way for CTPs and our partners in the federal government. But thank you very much for your insights there. Okay, so on to the actual methodologies to do this for our flood hazards, and a little bit of a peek at a timeline. of how long it may be before you see this information in your backyard. So as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, we are partnering with the Corps of Engineers in the development of a lot of this data. This is true for the Atlantic, Gulf, Caribbean islands, and the Great Lakes at the moment, where we are working closely with the Corps of Engineers, ERDIC, the Engineering Research and Development Center, Coastal Lab, to develop more data leveraging their probabilistic coastal hazard analysis methodology that you see here. These are all different types of storm tracks that have been moved around the study areas based off of different hurricane parameters and their weighted probabilities that they use to develop the coastal storm response hazard curves. They have completed analysis for a lot of these geographies, due in part to FEMA's investments in coastal studies through flood insurance studies throughout the US over the past 10 to 15 to 20 years now, where we made the goal to study and update all of our flood insurance rate maps for the populated US coastline. In doing so, we leveraged probabilistic methodologies, ad surf modeling, et cetera, that have been ingested by the Corps of Engineers, and they have improved upon the studies themselves and re-parameterized and processed them. And that is the data that we are leveraging, such that we are speaking kind of from the same, or singing from the same song sheet with the Corps of Engineers when it comes to coastal hazard data. And they are reprocessing these regional storm surge studies that you see here for the US Atlantic coast. So this is the coastal Texas study, Louisiana study, all through the Gulf of Mexico, the South Atlantic, the Puerto Rico and US Virgin Islands study, and the North Atlantic NAC study. And we are having them reprocess the results instead of on the save nodes that they are already on. If you're familiar with these studies, they are being reprocessed on all of the AdSurf node mesh locations. So that way we have a well-refined spatially and frequency-wise set of results for these areas. And so these annual exceedance frequency estimates are for still water level or storm surge elevations, significant wave height, peak wave period. We also have the uncertainty bands that are associated with it. And we have already gotten some of the results in-house, Louisiana, the North Atlantic, and these are some of the results that you are seeing here. And so as we have received this data, it's honestly in like a CSV file. It's nodal data that we have had to reprocess to visualize it for folks of what this looks like and what it can mean to folks that interact with flood hazard and risk information. And so I'm going to be demoing this data in a few slides and showing just a quick preview of how we're exploring it and what are some of the strengths of the data, where is it still kind of confusing and could be better communicated. So I will be covering that shortly. But for the interior of our nation, we have our work cut out for us. We are evaluating appropriate methodologies to do similar probabilistic flood hazard and risk assessments for all watersheds in the US. We are developing standard operating procedures through an interagency agreement, and they are focusing on study areas that are HUC4 boundaries that have smaller model domains within them. If you are familiar with HUCs, there are over 240 HUC4s that fall within the United States. You can see a picture of them here. And in we're in planning stages with the Corps of Engineers of how we would roll out this modeling campaign nationally. And we are considering the approach of headwaters to the seas. So that way we can ensure that as we move downstream, that all of our studies are working well together, the upstream boundary conditions work well with the downstream boundary conditions, and also allow the research into how to handle the coastal and riverine interface to continue, as that is still going on with the Corps of Engineers and will continue to be going on for the next year or so. The standard operating procedures that are being developed by the Corps of Engineers look a little different than your traditional risk map study, although they can be broken down into similar-ish modeling components where you start with a scoping effort. Again, this is using the HUC-4 boundaries and identifying your project team and your modeling domains and all of your data sets, and starting to actually develop your 2D RAS models and HMS models and ResSim that you may need in your HUC-4 boundary. These models through development are validated and calibrated before they are then used in running thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of probabilistic simulations and then resulting statistical analysis to develop the annual exceedance probabilities throughout the domain. And our estimates based off of the pilot studies is that this modeling effort to actually set up the validated, calibrated models, get them running in the cloud and under probabilistic simulations should really be a much shorter time frame than we've traditionally been working under. And we think that this work can roughly be done under a year's time for a HUC-4. And then that data set that comes out of it, turning it into a deliverable or a product like a flood insurance rate map would then take an additional 6 months to, let's say, 6 years as an example. And that's because taking the annual exceedance probabilities and developing risk data sets is not challenging. It's a computational exercise. The data can be delivered in GIS even very quickly. So those types of data and product deliveries we estimate would be on the short-term range after one of these modeling campaigns complete. However, products such as regulatory products that have to go through due process would still be on the longer end of that scale. Okay, so for our pilot areas, I'm going to do a time check. We have 3 pilots going on with our inland studies right now. All the way on the right here is the Kanawha Basin, and this is mostly in West Virginia. It starts in North Carolina and moves north. This was our first pilot area that has resulted in the initial standard operating procedures from the Corps of Engineers. However, we are now kicking off the Duwamish pilot, which is shown in the upper left. It drains out in the Seattle area. It's in Washington State. And we're using lessons learned from that and the Trinity to improve the SOP and refine it as we keep approaching more complex study areas. So the Kanawha, our first pilot, was a fairly simple one with not a lot of structures or control releases or even a lot of population. But we are progressively getting harder with the Duwamish and then the Trinity River and really putting the standard operating procedures to the test that the Corps of Engineers are developing for us right now. So under that sort of scoping and model development portion of it, this is an example for the Kanawha, where the HUC-4 was actually broken down into 4 separate subbasins that each were modeled separately. And we also used 6 calibration and validation events that you see on the right throughout the domain to make sure that these models were kind of behaving appropriately, and as expected before moving into probabilistic simulations, where we're trying to look at all different types of flood events and potential hazards that could occur. To develop the precipitation forcing for the probabilistic simulations, we are using stochastic storm transposition, which you're seeing a graphic of right here. This is the outline of the HUC4 and some different, this is one event actually that I think is being transposed from the south towards the north of the watershed. So you can see how this one historical event that has been observed precipitation event is then being transposed throughout the watershed based off of meteorological domains that have been determined to be that these storms can equally occur throughout that entire domain. And so an example of that here is the transposition domain is that larger hatched outline where observed precipitation events can be drawn from there and then transposed throughout the HUC4 domain. In order to do this stochastic storm transposition, which is like a leap forward, but based in the historical literature, we definitely need to be modernizing the management and delivery of the data catalogs that are associated with this, and develop methods to flexibly store and manage these resources. And we're working closely with the Corps of Engineers and our PTS providers on improving the way that we do this, so that our studies are moving into the future. And so now you're seeing on your screen results from what happens when you do the stochastic storm transposition. These are the results actually just from 1,000 events. We are about to initiate, I think it's 100,000 events. It feels like a lot. The Corps of Engineers is running the full suite of storms to develop all of the uncertainties. So this does not have the uncertainties, but this is some of the initial results that we're seeing in Princeton, West Virginia. And looking at it, you're like, great, it looks graduated. That was the type of, that is what we were looking for visually in the results. But we wanted to know how good they actually were. And so one thing that we know we rely on for its precision is the flood insurance rate map. And so we pulled that in for the area here. And so I'll go back to the original. These are the results out of the canal pilot. And you can see with the SFHA and the floodway overlaid on it, those results are really promising and exciting. But here's another location where you can see similarly, I mean, the results are graduated. That's exciting. They are matching the general floodplain, but there are also areas of these zone A's that we did not capture in our analysis. And why didn't we capture any flooding in our analysis? And those are the types of questions we're starting to ask ourselves, and we've actually started to reprocess the results that you're seeing here just due to the reviews. One of the other points of comparison that we can rely on are National Flood Insurance claims data that's privacy protected, but it is also our hope that if we are demonstrating an area has some probability of flooding, we would not hope that there are claims, but there should be claims within that footprint too. And if we are still having large amounts of claims that have been observed outside of it, we know that we're missing something in our model. And that is the type of analysis that we're trying to evaluate right now and figure out how best to kind of QC this data, see where improvements or changes are needed to the SOP, and then continue to refine it on our pilot studies. Okay, so here is a little timeline that shows on the top the timing of the canal pilot, which was supposed to end in August. We did get the data in August, but through those investigations I just mentioned, we're reprocessing some of the data and making improvements on the initial draft SOP. We have also kicked off the Duwamish and the Trinity, both of which are expected to be complete around this summer. Those pilots are being used to make an interim version of the SOP this spring that we are going to be using to develop draft 2D RAS guidance that will be used for SOP execution by the risk map program in the future. We will be publishing this draft guidance this summer, so please keep your eyes out for it. And we'll be using this guidance at the end of September as we initiate our first HUC4s for probabilistic modeling. And we are planning on starting that in fiscal year 25. Okay, so just to demonstrate some of the use cases, the data coming out of these studies is challenging, and we want to make sure that it's deliverable. We don't want the data to be challenging to end users, unless they want it to be, in which case we want to support that as well. But we really think that just because the data is complex, that the messaging and the decisions do not have to be. And so as part of FFRD, our comms folks, if you guys have ever met Peter Herrick, we're leading a flood information ecosystem analysis that was broader than just looking at the risk map or NFIP ecosystem, but the broad flood information ecosystem in the United States. And we went through a year-long effort to interview many stakeholders. I'm sure some of you on the phone may have been interviewed yourself. And we developed 4 kind of generic personas. And these customer personas are used to help guide us in understanding the types of folks that are going to be interested in FFRD data, help provide insights into what type of information is most useful for them, and help guide us in future product development. And so, for example, not all floodplain managers are going to be persona 1, the flood data expert. 2 different floodplain managers could be in different persona boxes. Perhaps one is a flood data expert, but one is more so a community champion. And they are very receptive to amplifying simplified info and are less comfortable in creating the data and managing the data and expressing it in a technical manner. And so what this is just helping us to identify is how different personas of folks want to interact with the data. They're all not going to be engineers that want to know everything about the uncertainty analysis and how we got to it. They may just want to advocate for certain aspects of the data, or be more interested in like user-friendly tools that they can advocate with. And so I share these to say we will be using these as lenses to evaluate some of the data and use cases that I'm going to present today, and that these data and use cases that I'm going to show us are not final, and they are just meant to start to inspire more discussion and ideas from folks of what types of decisions this data can help you with, and then how we need to display the data to help you with that decision. So we started demonstrating this through a visualization prototype that came out in September for internal use. But we shared it at a CTP symposium that occurred in September that Laura Algio organized. You're seeing a picture from that up here, where we got direct feedback from CTPs on what data was useful for them, what aspects of FFRD do they need more information from, and just start to get more feedback from very important stakeholders. And so the bottom left just shows when we polled the CTPs, they all seem to find that there was a lot of potential benefits of the data that we're presenting here, but also a lot of challenges with it. And I definitely agree with it. And we had also asked them how familiar are you with FFRD. That group provided a little bit stronger of a response on just saying they had been to a few presentations. And we also asked them, of the presented information, what are the most interesting or promising aspects to you? And I was really excited to see that the results were across the board. Folks really want to access the raw data, but they also are interested in the technical framework and the potential for regulatory updates that can come from this data. So now on to the use case prototyping. I have starred the ones that I wanted to talk about. That's what the star represents, but I'll include all of them in the PDF that I share. So if I skip over one, you can go back and check it out. But the first data use case we have is just the annual exceedance probability of flooding in a location. And it's based on the probabilistic analysis of all flood scenarios. And it shows you if there's an extreme chance of flooding in a location each year down to a very low, maybe like 1,000-year flood event. And so we have this data, which can be intersected with the built environment so that you can assign different structures with a likelihood of flooding, and do the same with like road segments as well too. So that way you're not looking just at a graduated floodplain, you're just looking at the actual structures. We have flood depths for each of the different annual exceedance probabilities, as well as flood velocities for each exceedance probability. So that way, which is analogous to our coastal, where we have wave heights for each annual exceedance probability, as well as the storm surge. And when you combine these two things together, whether it's wave heights and storm surge or flow depth and velocity, we start to get closer towards flood force and composite hazards, where we're bringing different aspects of the hazard together to convey the impacts that it can bring. This is an example for integrating it for specific annual exceedance probabilities. So this is the demonstration in coastal Louisiana, where we are combining the storm surge depth and the wave height for a certain annual exceedance probability to create a composite picture of where the hazards are the highest for that exceedance probability due to waves, for example, or what the driver is there. We can calculate damage estimates. We have flood hazard curves, which I showed earlier, and then flood risk curves showing the losses. Average annualized losses is that risk depiction that shows you what are the average losses that you can experience at a property. The ones that are very dark blue are going to be experiencing large losses quite often, whereas the yellow ones will not. And then finally, we have a composite flood hazard layer, which is a work in progress. This is where stakeholder feedback is really appreciated, where we are annualizing or integrating that flood hazard curve for all exceedance probabilities, calculating the area under the curve, and compositing it with different hazards. So this could be done with flood depth and flood velocity, or in this case, we have annualized the stillwater elevations and the wave heights to show which areas are the most risky because perhaps they have huge wave heights at all times, or they flood early and often and high, and to show you sort of the more dangerous areas of the flood hazard in a location. And that is the composite flood hazard. And so now I would like to quickly just launch the viewer if I can manage to do this. And share my screen. Okay, so I think I'm doing this right. All right, So again, this is an internal prototype. So unfortunately, I cannot share it. Although at the CTP symposium, we had it live for the CTPs in the room for the day, just because we're using this internally to help us understand how this data could be used in the NFIP and what different groups would find most useful, as well as helping us in RiskMap understand what type of visualizations and products are possible. So this location is in Slidell, Louisiana, just north of New Orleans, where we have the Corps of Engineers Louisiana Comprehensive Study. We have added into it building footprints. Those are the white dots. I'm going to turn them on and off so you can see that. But it uses the National Structure Inventory attributes and Microsoft Bing footprints to actually show estimated structures in the study area and their attributes so that we can use them for visualizing how they relate to the flood hazards. Okay, so I'm going to turn the buildings off for a second and just show you that we have the flood hazard data layers in here. I'm going to make it slightly transparent here. And this is the 10% annual exceedance probability. We also have the 5%, the 2%, the 1%, the 0.2%, and the 1,000 and the 0.1%, the 1,000-year loaded in here. And you can see that the flood extents change with the annual exceedance probability. So the 1,000-year annual exceedance probability is much larger than the 10% chance annual exceedance probability. We also have that data for wave heights here. That's the purplish color. So you can see areas of high wave heights offshore here for the 10%, but that color, if you will, or that hazard moves inland as the annual exceedance probability increases. We have those integrated coastal hazard layers loaded in as well, which are specific for each annual exceedance probability, and it's a combination of the wave height and the storm surge. But we also have that annualized integrated composite hazard layer that I just discussed that shows the varying nature of the flood hazards in the community across the whole frequency spectrum, which is here. But I also wanted to show how you can use this information, and this is really what we're trying to start to tease out from folks to make different decisions. And so I'm going to pick two structures for fun. And you can see that both of these locations that I selected have structures available. So I successfully clicked structure, but they have different annual exceedance probabilities of flooding. So as location A isn't expected to flood until roughly the 500-year, location B would not until the 1,000-year. If you look at location A, we are pulling data from the NSI, the National Structure Inventory, that's telling us that point A, or structure A, is a residential structure, slab on grade, must really be on fill because the building's first floor is at 10 feet. And you can see that relative to the annual exceedance probabilities and our confidence intervals, that this structure is pretty well elevated above the flood hazard. And then you can also see the wave heights expected here. And then if you go to structure B, it similarly is elevated. It has a foundation or a basement, however, and it is elevated well above the flood hazard as well. But one thing that we can do here is look at the comparison of flooding, turning on the confidence interval, turn off those actually. You can see the comparison of flooding and the flood hazard curves between the two structures. That location A does have a much higher storm surge potential. The depths in those areas can get all the way up to 5 feet at structure A, whereas for structure B, the flood depth at the 1,000-year may only get to roughly 1 foot. So if there were not structures in this location, you're able to understand better where the hazards are the highest, and make different decisions potentially, or on where you want to buy a home or site a home, or make different types of investments. So I just wanted to share this very rough draft prototype. We're working on improvements to it right now, including an incorporation of a pilot area in Texas that has 2 sea level rise conditions dynamically modeled into it. So that way a user could look at this view for current hazards in a location, but also look at how those hazards change under different sea level conditions. And we hope to be exploring that data shortly on the viewer, as well as a querying functionality, just to help folks start to get curious, like, where are all the structures that have annual extremes probability of, what's going to flood every year? How do we query all of those structures and identify them and maybe start to prioritize them for mitigation? And so getting curious about what type of application we may want helps us understand what type of data functionality we need to support FFRD. Okay, so I'm going to pull back up my PowerPoint presentation and finish this out. I did not need to use my backup slides, but I think we have one more poll question, because I know that this was a lot of information and you will need more on FFRD. So I have this final poll question for you on what kinds of training, support, or assistance would be most helpful for you to drive flood resilient outcomes using comprehensive flood hazard and risk information.
Awesome. Thanks, Christina. So same as the first couple, give you some time to respond there. Just a quick note, however, we will have one more poll question. It's not related to Christina's presentation here. It'll just be a simple webinar rating, but I just wanted to let people know that there will be one more poll at the very, very end, and I'll prompt you for that one. But let's take a look at the results here.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing this. I agree, more webinars are probably in our future, as well as helping folks out with technical assistance. I think that's a great way to learn how to use this data, and really just in-person training, again, seems to be really useful, getting your hands dirty with the data. So thank you very much for all of your responses and listening.
All right. Well, thank you, Christina. There was a lot of really excellent information there. I doubt you've had a chance to take a peek, but we've got, it looks like about over 50 questions now. So just for your sake and for the audience as well, we certainly aren't going to have time to be able to get to every single one of those. We've got about 20 minutes here. We'll do our best to get through as many as we can, and then we'll probably be following up with the group here with some of our outstanding questions. We'll get written responses to, and then we'll send that out when we send out the certificates of attendance and the recording and other promised follow-up as well. So just wanted to let everybody know, if you asked a question, we really appreciate it. We're going to try to get to a bunch of them, but I know that we're not going to be able to get to them all, and we will try to get them addressed after the fact if we can. So having said all that, I'll kick off the Q&A just with a question about flood insurance. So how does FEMA envision incorporating data from the FFRD initiative with its flood insurance pricing approach? Do they envision no longer needing to use outside CAT models? So
that is a great question. I would like to know the answer to it as well. What I do know is that we created this data in response to the actuarial need for more comprehensive flood hazard and risk information with uncertainties quantified. We are developing this data to deliver it to the actuaries with risk information as well, but how it may be incorporated into the rating process in the future and what part it plays in that is still to be determined, because we are working on delivering the results to them for that review still.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Anna had a couple of questions, and just bear with me because it's a little bit of a longer one. I can repeat some of this if you need to, but a couple of questions. Stochastic storm transposition might be useful for stormwater utilities and other stakeholders who do their own modeling. Are there plans to share that work publicly? And then sort of an add-on to that, how will the FFRD approach urban drainage systems? How does the FFRD align with the initiative to create flood risk maps for sea level rise, FFRMS? So a few different ones there. You can pick and choose or address any of those you might be able to.
Okay, I will try to answer them all.
Okay.
So we intend on having the models developed through FFRD be accessible and reusable and interoperable. So we would, in an ideal scenario, really like to create these models at a HUC 4 level and then see local communities sort of check them out, improve them, add in whatever information they would like to, check them back in, or check them out and just use them for whatever it is that you have a need for in your local community, whether it's improving the RAS modeling, adding in stormwater infrastructure, adding in more features than may have been captured in the initial modeling campaign, through just, again, open source interoperable modeling. Of course, we need an IT foundation to do that, that supports it, but we are working with the Corps of Engineers on the concept of like a model library that helps us understand where these models are, how to access them, as well as how to improve them. Urban drainage, initially we are going to be making some assumptions with what we expect is going on with urban drainage based off of available information and just assumptions we're going to have to make. But again, being able to like take those models, refine them, use them at a different, more local scale for those analysis is something we hope will occur, and that we will also be improving the way that we're capturing that type of flooding in the future. And then for sea level rise, we are, the Corps of Engineers has dynamically modeled for each of the study areas 2 sea level rise conditions in the ADCIRC modeling, but it is my understanding that it does not incorporate like urban drainage or those issues in the results.
So Katrina, this is Alan with one quick follow-up question. You said that you're going to make it accessible so people can download it and use it for their purposes. Are you then going to be using the LOMAR process then for people to upload those changes and improvements into your system so that those changes then your modeling can be improved over time?
Yeah, that's a really great question and way to do it. We've not determined the best way to do that yet. I think that we're going to have to get it into action and test out the best ways to do that with the RAS team and HEC.
All right. Thank you, Christina. So this is Kevin again. Got a question from Rebecca, a comment and a question. And this came in while you were demoing the prototype. So Rebecca says, we regularly encounter community officials, usually elected officials actually, that don't want to do anything in excess of what is required to satisfy the NFIP minimum requirements. And she's actually asking, would you do a scenario that shows how those communities would use those products? But and if you can't do that, just maybe if you would be able to elaborate on how they might be able to use those products in such a scenario.
Great. Well, one of the first things I've heard is that we should not be calling it non-regulatory information and data, so that way it's maybe more appealing to community officials. But I definitely understand that even with that, there's no interest in going above and beyond the minimum. We hope that this data could be used to derive your minimum, whatever the minimum standard is, and support the maps that you may need to manage it. But I am hopeful that this data will also be able to highlight the residual risk in the community that exists if you just regulate to your minimum standards, and allow you to be able to more easily communicate to community officials the benefit and the payoff that you get from leveraging higher standards in your specific community. It's one of the cool things about this data that we've not put into practice is that it does allow you to say, like, what if, pretty easily. What if we did something with a higher standard? What if we regulated this area a little bit differently? What kind of savings would our community see? What type of loss of damages would occur during a flood event? And use the money and the savings for communication. But I definitely understand that there are elected officials that feel that way.
Yep, that makes sense. Very good, thank you. So a couple of questions about sort of the scope and things like that. I'm just going to lump Dennis and Elena's questions together. Dennis says, does FEMA have funding to do this modeling nationwide? And if so, how quickly could it be deployed? And so sort of a funding and rollout question there. And then Elena is asking, is the goal to get this data service available for all of the US existing firm areas? And is there an area prioritization method, or how are the pilot areas determined?
Great questions. Okay, so our funding and our ability to roll this out nationally is, of course, going to be determined by our annual appropriations that we're given for the RISMAP program and our ability to put money towards creating this data each year. But even in a best case scenario of unlimited funds, coming at us, getting this type of modeling coverage across the entire United States, like CONUS, OCONUS, like everywhere, all the HUC4s in the US will need to have data analyzed. It's going to take a very long time. And that's one in part due to just the size of our country. And also, I think that we're going to quickly reach a cap of the types of folks that can do this data, and just our H&H engineers out there. There are not an infinite supply of us that can do this. So we're expecting that, the rollout is obviously dependent on our appropriations and our ability to prioritize this work. But we're expecting that to get inland coverage, it will take about 10 years from the start of the effort based off of our current schedule. For areas of prioritization, I guess it's sort of two parts. We selected our pilot areas. I think that there were available SWIMS models that the Corps of Engineers had created in all of these locations. We also knew that we wanted to have pilot areas of increasing complexity, and that we knew that there were certain types of features we weren't ready to handle yet, like certain geographies of the US that we might not want to start with. So we started with the Kanawha. It got selected through a series of filtering out. And then we followed up with the Duwamish and the Trinity, knowing that they had increased complexity and were meeting certain criteria that we had for pilot selection. But as for implementation nationally and how we would prioritize which watersheds we would start with, As I mentioned earlier, we're working with the concept of headwaters to the seas. There are a lot of headwaters. Which ones we start is going to be a discussion of like, where is there data availability, such as like SWIMS models that the Corps has already created. Where do we have willing partners that are in the regions that will help us initiate this modeling? Where are their populations? And so we are just now getting to that selection phase where we're laying out what the order of rollout will look like nationally, with the assumption of we will be starting at headwaters and sort of moving down systems to the sea, but then laying out what that actual modeling order looks like it still needs to be done.
Yep. Okay. That is very helpful and insightful. Thank you. Our next question, it has to do with some of the maybe the nuances of the risk layers. So Donna is asking, and I know Christina, we're kind of bouncing around here, but that's sort of the nature of the Q&A we have going. But Donna is saying, are the risk layers precipitation based? We experience flooding, in my community when the winds are out of the west and it's high tide, so not necessarily any precipitation at all in that case. So she's just wondering how the risk layers are based.
Great. So areas that are driven by like wind-driven storm surge or water levels, those sound very coastal to me, and so we'll be modeling those with wind and pressure fields and AdCirc modeling that the Corps of Engineers has already done. The rest of our modeling will be precipitation and HMS based with like flow inputs, base flow, and excess precip derived from the precipitation and the stochastic storm transposition, and then used in RAS to move around the excess precip and the flows that we're modeling.
Okay, that absolutely makes sense. I am, as I said, we've got a lot of questions. I'm scrolling through and sifting through some of them. Alan, did you see any that you wanted to make sure we address with the group? I know we've got some time left, but I just want to make sure if you had any that you wanted to make sure we all heard the answer to, that I gave you that opportunity.
Sure. This is one question was asked, and I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, is that when people are using HEC-RAS 2D, is that modeling going to be, those modeling efforts going to be incorporated, or will those skills be usable now in this new initiative?
Yes. RAS2D is very useful and will be used in this initiative, and our modeling efforts are starting out with a review of available models in your location, whether it's regulatory, BLE, maybe a model that's out there floating that we have heard about, to kind of capture all of them within the HUC4 and incorporate them to the best of our abilities into the wider model.
Okay, and then there's one other question I thought was useful, is that you're using the National Structure Inventory and the Bing data sets, it sounds like. The comment was that these data sets have a fair amount of errors in them, and how do you address the fact that the errors in your structured data will be an issue?
Great question. Yes, there are errors in it. I think that the NSI is not necessarily one-to-one with what's on the ground. And if we are leveraging the NSI and that's true, like it says that there's a basement and it's on the open coast, and we know that's not true because it was built in 2015, like that's something that we want to improve. But we will have to work with the Corps of Engineers on any changes to the NSI. That was a comment that we had also heard at the CTP symposium in September, was one of the first comments of like, well, if you're going to use the NSI, how do we get our community, our county, our state data into it? So we definitely hear that need, do not have an answer today.
All right, very good. We've got a couple minutes left, And Christina, thanks for hanging in there. We're going to do, I think, a couple of more, and then we'll wrap up. But Shannon actually had a question I thought was a little bit interesting. But has there been consideration given to the availability of results? Will they be rolled out to homeowners, lenders, realtors, just non-technical people in general who would have use for it?
We do not know how this information will roll out from FEMA's side, at least. Beyond, we know we would like to make this coastal data that's been delivered from the Corps of Engineers, the raw data, accessible and available as soon as possible, even if it's just a download of the CSV file on FEMA.gov for academia or others to take and ingest and improve upon. But as for FEMA showing different data sets and directing them towards homeowners or financial institutions, lending institutions, those types of decisions have not been made. And it's part of the reason why we're doing the data and use case as well as the persona work to sort of see what are our personas, what data sets work best for them, what type of uses do they have for the data, and then how would we deliver it in an impactful way for them. Those types of decisions are just in their infancy, and we do not have yet a plan for.
Okay, thank you so much, Christina. So once again, a lot of outstanding questions. We're going to do our best to make sure we get written responses to as many of these as we can. Alan, did you have any closing remarks you wanted to finish up with? Otherwise, I'll do the sign off.
No, she did a great job. I do want to
Okay.
thank her for the presentation, and also give a shout out to Laura Algio for all her help with the Cooperating Technical Partner Program, as long as I've got the podium at the moment. So that's the only comments I had. And the major issue, of course, is accessibility to the data, and the fact that how it can be updated with the very precise information that people develop in conjunction with flood insurance studies.
Yep, very well said. Thank you. So, as I said, we're going to do one final poll. It's just a simple rating for our event today here. Let me get this open for you. You can go ahead and weigh in on your thoughts. So as you think about that and get back to us with some of that feedback, again, just want to leave you with a few closing remarks, sort of the admin announcement vein. Number one, there's going to be quite a bit of follow-up from this event. We'll have the event recorded. We're going to have the slide deck. We're going to have written responses to Q&A. We're also going to have certificates of attendance for those of you who stuck it out with us for the duration here today. So all that's going to be coming to you. You'll be emailed all of that probably next week, Wednesday, potentially Tuesday, otherwise Wednesday. So it'll take us about a week to turn all that around. Please bear with us. But just wanted to let you all know that is coming. And then beyond that, once again, this is a quarterly webinar series. If you have anything you want to know more about, or you think might make a good topic, please feel free to reach out, and we'll definitely be making those types of considerations based on recommendations. Other than that, thank you very much, Christina, for sharing today. Like I said, tons of really good information, a lot of questions and discussion going on about this. So definitely a very hot topic. And thanks to all of you for attending, taking time out of your day to join us. Again, we do these quarterly, so we'll be reaching out to you not only with the promised follow-up from this event, but the next when we get the next one scheduled, we'll be sending you an email about that as well. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and we hope to talk to you soon.